I landed back in the country after 8 months overseas, took a taxi from the airport to the house I owned, put my key in the front door, and found that my mother-in-law should rearranged my living room. She opened the door before I could finish unlocking it. She was wearing a house coat I'd never seen before in a house that had my name on the mortgage. She said, with a small, warm smile that I would spend the next several months unpacking, "Welcome back, honey. Come see what we've done with the place." My name is Renata. I'm 30 years old now. I was 29 when I got home from that trip, jet-lagged and disoriented in more ways than I had any way to anticipate. And what followed over the next 6 weeks taught me that some battles can only be won with a piece of paper, and that the most important thing I'd done in my entire adult life was never let anyone else's name get added to mine on that title. Marcus and I had bought our house 2 years before I took the overseas contract. It was a 3-bedroom in a quiet suburb. Not the house either of us had imagined exactly, but the house we could afford at 27 and 28, with combined savings and a mortgage that stretched us comfortably but not dangerously. Both our names on the title, both our names on the mortgage. We painted the front door ourselves on a Saturday afternoon the week after closing, standing on the porch with rollers and an argument about what shade of blue counted as not too much. And that afternoon felt in the specific way that some afternoons feel, like a beginning. I'm a civil engineer, and the overseas contract was the kind of opportunity you read about in industry newsletters and think will happen to someone else. 8 months working on infrastructure development in a country I'd never lived in before. Significant work that would advance my career by what most people in my field estimated as 3 to 5 years in terms of experience and visibility. Marcus and I talked it through over several evenings before I accepted. The time difference, the communication logistics, the 8 months of solo household management he'd be taking on. He told me to go. He said he'd be fine. He said 8 months would pass quickly. I believed him completely, and I want to say clearly that I still believe he meant it when he said it. Marcus's parents, Greta and Leonard, lived 40 minutes away. They were warm people, present people, the kind of parents who showed up for things: birthday dinners, minor home repairs, occasional Sunday meals that ran 3 hours longer than anyone planned. I had a genuinely good relationship with Greta in those early years. She'd helped me pick out curtains for the bedroom once. We'd had real conversations. 3 months into my contract, during one of our video calls, we called every few days, navigating a time difference that made it require actual scheduling. Marcus mentioned that his parents were staying for a bit. Their house had a plumbing issue, water damage to 2 bathrooms, and the contractor had given them a timeline of 3 to 4 weeks. He'd offered them the guest room. I said, of course, that's fine. That's what family does. And I meant it. The 3 to 4 weeks became 6 weeks, then 8. Then Marcus started saying soon when I asked about a timeline, in a tone I would only later recognize as the tone of someone who has stopped expecting a thing to be true, but hasn't yet figured out how to say that. I was deep in project work, adapting to a demanding schedule and a new environment, maintaining a marriage across 9 time zones. I didn't push. I accepted vague answers I wouldn't have accepted in person because distance made it easier to accept things you can't directly see. I came home 8 months later on a flight that landed at 6 in the morning, took a taxi with my luggage, and arrived at my own front door with the specific, exhausted anticipation of someone who has been away from home long enough that every ordinary detail of it has become precious in memory. Greta opened the door before my key finished turning. She was dressed and awake. It was early, but she was clearly already up, which meant she'd been getting up early in my house for some time, long enough to have established a morning routine. She smiled at me. She called me honey. She said, "Come see what we've done with the place." I stepped inside and stood in my own entryway and looked at a house that was still recognizably mine and also, in dozens of small ways, no longer arranged by the person who owned it. The furniture in the living room had been shifted. There was a new lamp in the corner I'd never bought. The shelves in the hallway, which had held our wedding photos and a collection of small sculptures Marcus and I had accumulated from travels, now held framed photos of grandchildren, Marcus's nieces and nephews, children I knew and liked, children who did not live in this house. My own photos were in a cardboard box in the bedroom closet. I found them there 3 days later. My father-in-law Leonard had a recliner in the living room, positioned at an angle that blocked the television from the couch where I had always sat. The refrigerator had been reorganized. The guest room, which had been painted a particular shade of sage green I'd spent weeks choosing, now had new curtains, a different bedspread, and a small reading chair I'd never seen before, arranged in a way that communicated something permanent rather than something temporary. I asked on my second day home, gently and as diplomatically as I could manage while still jet-lagged, when Greta and Leonard were planning to return to their own house. I said it as a genuine question, without edge, giving every possible good faith interpretation of the situation the room it deserved. Greta put down her coffee cup and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize, something between warmth and a kind of settled patience, the expression of someone who is about to say something they've said before and expect to need to say it again. "Renata," she said, "this is family property. We all look out for each other." I said the house was in my name and Marcus's name specifically, that it wasn't shared property in any formal sense. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Marcus is family too, honey, which makes it family property," as though that sentence had a logic that would become clear to me if I thought about it long enough. I didn't push the conversation further that day. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in my own bedroom and called my sister, 3 time zones away, and spoke quietly for 20 minutes about how surreal it felt to be a guest in a house where I paid the mortgage. I want to describe what I found in that living room more carefully, because the details matter. They tell you something about how long Greta had been thinking of this house as hers to arrange. The furniture rearrangement wasn't random. The couch where I always sat had been moved to accommodate Leonard's recliner. My couch in my living room had been repositioned around someone else's chair. The books on the living room shelves had been reorganized by size rather than by the completely different system I use, which tells you she spent time on it. This wasn't accidental adjustment, it was deliberate reordering. The kitchen had also been reorganized. My spices were in a different cabinet, the pots were stacked in a new order, and there was a prayer booklet on the counter near the stove that I'd never seen before and told me Greta's daily routine had fully moved in. I stood in my own kitchen at 7 in the morning on my second day home and couldn't find the cumin. That's a small thing. It is also when you are jet-lagged and processing the existential experience of returning to a home that has been rearranged around someone else's life, not a small thing at all. What I found hardest in those first days was the photos. My wedding photos, Marcus and me at the ceremony, at the reception, the specific one I loved from just before we walked in, where we were both laughing at something someone behind the camera had said, had been moved off the living room shelves to make space for framed prints of grandchildren, and were sitting in a cardboard box in our bedroom closet, nicely stacked, as though they'd been filed away rather than displaced. I found them on day 3. I sat with them in the closet for a while before I put them back on the shelf one by one in the spots they'd come from. Over the following days, I started gathering information like I'd been trained to gather information for complex engineering assessments, systematically, without tipping my hand, documenting everything before drawing conclusions. I found on the 3rd day a document on the kitchen counter, left out, I think, entirely accidentally, which is a kind of luck I almost felt guilty about, showing that Greta had been added as an authorized contact on our homeowner's insurance policy, not as a policyholder, as an authorized representative, a status that meant she could call and discuss our coverage, request information, report claims.
Marcus had added her during my absence, during what I'd assumed was a temporary houseguest situation, at a level of administrative integration that assumed something much longer than a few weeks.
I found later that week, through a careful reading of a text thread Marcus had accidentally left open on the kitchen iPad, that Greta had contacted a local attorney several months earlier about the concept of establishing residency rights after extended occupancy. The attorney, from what I could see of the response, had been somewhat discouraging. Residency claims don't function the way Greta seemed to believe they did, especially in a property with clear, documented ownership. But the fact that she had made that inquiry, that she had been thinking about legal mechanisms for claiming a stake in my house while I was overseas working, told me everything I needed to know about what had been happening in my home during my absence. I confronted Marcus directly. I want to be honest that this conversation was one of the hardest I've ever had. Not because Marcus was hostile. He wasn't. He was devastated. He could see clearly on my face what I'd found and what it meant. But because the explanation he gave me was, in some ways, worse than hostility would have been. He hadn't wanted to cause drama while I was overseas. He'd thought his parents would leave on their own before I got back. He'd let it drift week after week because raising it would have required a difficult conversation with his mother, and he'd been choosing the path that avoided that conversation so consistently and for so long that he hadn't fully registered how badly it had compounded. I pulled our title documents that same evening, both our names exactly as they'd been at closing 2 years earlier. Nothing else. No one else. Greta's belief in family property had no legal basis whatsoever. It existed entirely in the space between what she wanted to be true and what the actual paperwork said. I want to say something about Marcus that I've said to him directly and that I think is important to say here. The 6 months of couples counseling we did afterward were not about whether he was a good husband. He is a good husband. They were about a specific, identifiable pattern, the way he had been raised to manage conflict with his parents by absorbing it rather than addressing it, by letting things extend and drift and hoping they'd resolve before reaching the point of requiring a direct conversation that might disappoint them. That pattern had worked, from his perspective, for 40 years because his parents had always eventually reached a natural stopping point. They had not, in this case, reached a natural stopping point because I wasn't there to be considered in the calculation, and because Greta had quietly decided that my absence was the stopping point's indefinite extension. He understood this, eventually, with the help of a good therapist. He understood that the pattern that had served him in his family of origin was actively harmful in the context of a marriage where another person's home and comfort and sense of safety were involved. That understanding is real, and it's ongoing, and it's why I believe us when I say we're in a better place now. I consulted a real estate attorney named Patricia within the week. She confirmed what I suspected. Greta and Leonard were legally guests, not residents, not tenants. They had no lease, no rental agreement, no legal occupancy status beyond the informal invitation Marcus had extended without consulting me. As a titled owner, I had the full legal right to ask them to leave, with proper written notice as required by our state's laws around house guests and informal occupancy, even over Marcus's objection if it came to that. Patricia also told me something important. The longer they remained without formal written notice, the more complicated it could potentially become from an occupancy standpoint. Not because Greta's attorney inquiry had merit, but because time and inaction can create complications in informal occupancy situations that proper, timely notice cleanly prevents. We needed to move within the week. I spent 2 evenings trying to explain this to Marcus, not as an ultimatum, but as a simple reality. He needed to understand that this wasn't about whether his parents were good people. It was about the fact that my house had been used for 8 months in a way I'd never agreed to, and that the situation required active resolution, not more passive hoping. On the third evening of those conversations, he agreed. He agreed to co-sign the 30-day notice with me, both our names, both our signatures, hand-delivered. I told him that his name on that notice mattered to me, that if he wasn't willing to put his name beside mine on asking his own parents to leave our own house, then our marriage had a more serious foundational problem than overdue houseguests, one we needed to address directly. He signed it. I don't take that for granted. We delivered the notice on a Saturday morning. Marcus and I stood together in our own living room while Greta read it, Leonard reading over her shoulder. The silence lasted long enough to become something else, not just quiet, but the specific silence of people recalibrating what they'd believed was going to be allowed to continue indefinitely. Greta looked up at me. She said, "This is cold, Renata. This is not how family treats each other." She said unfamily-like twice. She looked at Marcus and I watched him not flinch, which cost him something, and which I have never forgotten. I told her, in the same even voice I use in engineering project meetings when something has gone wrong and everyone in the room is emotional, except me, I had spent 2 years paying a mortgage on a title with my name on it. I had spent 8 months overseas, working hard, trusting my husband to manage our home. Her 8-month stay, regardless of how it came to be, regardless of the circumstances that extended it, did not transfer ownership of anything, and the notice period was 30 days from today. They moved out on day 29, 1 day before the deadline, into a rental Leonard had arranged quietly the week before. That rental told me everything. They had known the whole time that this would be the outcome if I pushed. They'd simply been waiting to see if I would. Marcus and I went through several difficult months afterward. We did couples counseling, specifically around his pattern of managing conflict by avoiding it until avoidance stopped being possible, a pattern that had operated beneath the surface of our marriage for long enough to cause real damage before becoming visible. We are in a better place now, a year later, because we did the work of addressing it honestly rather than smoothing it over. I don't take that for granted either. I changed something permanent in how we operate together. Any extended family stay over 30 days requires written agreement from both of us, renewed monthly. No exceptions, no emergency override clauses, no quiet drift into something neither of us explicitly consented to. It's a rule that didn't need to exist before. It does now. My relationship with Greta is civil, not warm. The warmth that used to be there has been replaced with something functional but careful, the way scar tissue replaces something softer. She has never acknowledged directly that what happened was wrong. She frames it, when it comes up, as a misunderstanding about how long their visit would be. I've stopped expecting a different framing. I don't regret the notice. Not once, not for a day, since the morning I handed it to her in my own living room. I regret that an 8-month work trip taken in good faith with my husband's full encouragement required me to come home and legally defend a house that had my name on the title the entire time, a defense that should never have been necessary because the title had never changed. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Greta about 2 months after they'd moved out that I've thought about often since. We were at a birthday dinner for Marcus's niece, one of the children whose photos had been on my shelves, and Greta and I were briefly in the kitchen together while everyone else was outside. There was a moment of quiet that had the particular quality of a moment between two people who have unfinished business and are both aware of it. She said, "I hope you know I genuinely thought of this house as family space." I said, "I know you did." She said, "I thought of you as family, Renata. I still do." I said, "I know that too." And that was the entire conversation, which was maybe all the conversation that was possible then. She hadn't said she was wrong. She hadn't apologized. She'd explained her interior experience of it, the beliefs, the framing, and I'd confirmed that I understood that belief had been genuine.
Neither of us said anything about the gap between genuine belief and actual authority, between feeling like family property and being legally family property, between what she'd wanted the situation to be and what the title document said it actually was. What I've come to understand a year out from that notice is that some people have an internal geography of belonging that overrides external documentation. In Greta's internal geography, any space where her son lives is a space where she has standing, and 8 months of continuous presence in that space had only deepened and solidified that sense of standing. The title was, to her, a legal technicality, a piece of paper that named official ownership but didn't capture the actual relational truth of what the house meant. My view is different. My view is that the title is the actual truth, that relational feelings about space are real but don't substitute for legal ownership, and that family is not a category that automatically includes all property associated with its members. We will probably never fully agree on this. We have found a way to exist in the same extended family without that agreement ever being explicitly acknowledged, which is a kind of functional peace that isn't the same as resolution, but is, I think, what we actually have available to us. I changed the front door color last spring. I put it back to the blue Marcus and I had argued about on that first Saturday afternoon 3 years ago, the one that felt like a beginning. It's that blue again. It's still ours. There's a version of this story, I know, where the reader or the listener thinks 8 months is a long time to not check in more carefully. 8 months is a long time to accept vague answers about a timeline. And that's not wrong. It's something I've been honest with myself about. What I want to offer is not an excuse, but a context, which is that managing a long-distance marriage across a significant time difference while doing demanding international project work produces a specific kind of cognitive and emotional load that narrows your bandwidth for secondary monitoring. I was doing the thing I was there to do with everything I had. I was maintaining the marriage I'd built with everything I had left over. There wasn't a third reserve for auditing situations that my husband had told me were fine. I've thought about whether I would handle it differently if I could do it over. The honest answer is that I would have been clearer earlier about what a few weeks actually meant. I would have set an explicit end date written before I left. I would have built in a check-in mechanism that didn't rely on Marcus's willingness to raise a difficult issue proactively. I would have learned earlier what I've since built into how I operate, that trusting your partner to manage things and establishing clear shared expectations before you leave are not the same thing, and that only the second one is actually a reliable system. The overseas contract ended professionally as one of the most valuable experiences of my career. The infrastructure work we completed is still standing. I have a different title now, more responsibility, a project portfolio that reflects what I learned there. I don't regret going. I wouldn't give back the professional outcome in exchange for not having to come home to rearranged furniture and a mother-in-law in my kitchen housecoat. But I think about the version of Renata who left for that airport 8 months ago, standing in the doorway with her bags, while Marcus hugged her and told her it would fly by. She trusted more completely than I do now. That trust was not naive. It was built on 2 years of partnership and evidence and love. But it was operating without the specific knowledge that some situations left unattended don't stay at the size they were when you last looked at them. I know things now that she didn't. I try not to be bitter about that. The knowing cost something, and the thing it cost was real, but the knowing is also real, and it's mine to keep. I've been asked since all of this whether I think Greta was deliberately scheming from the beginning, whether the a few weeks of plumbing work were a pretext designed to get a foothold that she intended from the start to make permanent. I don't believe that. I think the a few weeks were real, and I think the extension happened incrementally, like things extend when no one applies a clear deadline, and the temporary becomes comfortable for everyone there to feel it becoming comfortable. Greta felt at home in our house. She felt useful there, present there, in a way that probably felt good after however many years of her children growing up and establishing separate lives in separate cities. Marcus didn't push back. The foothold became a floor plan, became a lifestyle in the specific way that no one says stop produces. Where I think the deliberateness came in was not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle, somewhere around month 4 or 5, when the inquiry to the attorney about residency rights happened, when something shifted from "we're still here" to "what if we stayed here?" That inquiry was not the action of someone still thinking of themselves as a temporary guest. That was someone testing the legal landscape of a situation they'd started to imagine differently. I've let go, mostly, of trying to locate the exact moment where it turned. It doesn't change what I found when I got home. It doesn't change the title document, or the 30-day notice, or the conversation in the living room, or the recliner that blocked my view of my own television. Those things are what they are, regardless of when the intention shifted, or whether it ever quite hardened into what I might call a plan. What I hold on to is the document, the title with my name on it, unchanged throughout all of it, waiting patiently to mean what it had always meant, right up until the moment someone with my name on it decided to assert that meaning. I want to walk you through something I've thought about carefully since all of this resolved, which is the specific way that distance, physical distance, the kind that comes from being 8 months away in a different time zone, creates vulnerability in situations that would never have progressed this far if I hadn't been present. When you are home, you regulate your environment by being in it. You move through the rooms. You see what's there. You notice when a photo has been moved, or a cabinet reorganized, or a new piece of furniture has appeared. You notice because you are there, and your presence itself is a form of management, not controlling management, just the ordinary information that comes from inhabiting a space. When you are 8 months away, none of that information exists. You know your home only through what other people tell you about it, which means you know it only through the filters of what other people choose to communicate, what they think is important enough to mention, what they consider a change versus a trivial adjustment. Marcus didn't mention the photos. He didn't mention the recliner. He didn't mention the spice cabinet reorganization, obviously, but he also didn't mention that the energy of the house had shifted, that the space had absorbed another couple's habits and rhythms in a way that was visible from inside it, even if it wasn't easily articulatable. I don't think Marcus was deliberately hiding information from me.